Yeah, ham, mushroom. No, not pineapple. That's for lunatics and Hawaiians. Oh, hello, and welcome to Tweed's Garage. Subliminal. So, this is my Colchester Student 1800 lathe, which you may have seen on a previous video when I was moving it in. But now she's finally in a proper position, and I've sort of been through a little bit of a recommission because it had been sitting for about a year and a half, 2 years, not being used. So sort of time had taken its toll, and oils and things that hadn't been changed for quite a while. So yeah, I'll talk you through what I'd done to it to get it back to where it is now. So to start the recommissioning, the first thing to do was to drain the oil in the quick change gearbox, because I'd sort of heard that it gets a bit gungy in here. And so the first thing to do was take the side cover off and then move on in, find the drain plug and drain out the oil. What oil there was in there, there wasn't a lot, and it looked a bit custardy. So I decided to move on inside the gearbox, which involved taking off the switch plate by removing the 4 screws and then wiggling it, taking the lamp off and then wiggling it over the top of the stop button, which it does do. It does come off of there, as you can see, and then remove 6 screws on the front, and then remove the screws from this side panel here and remove the side panel to reveal the gearbox. And then it was a case of moving the carriage right towards the back of the lathe, so I've got a bit of movement on the ends of here, and then wiggle the gearbox forwards and sideways and out, but not rushing it straight away, because first you had to let the what oil didn't come out of the drain plug hole drop down onto the base of the machine and yeah, run out looking rather lovely, which then allowed us to, once that had drained out, to pull the gearbox forward and slightly to the sides to get it off of the shafts here to reveal the horrors inside. So you can see it sort of, it had gone quite nasty. Anything above the oil level had gone rusty, and that's why I was sort of having trouble selecting gears. The VW XYZ lever, this lever had frozen solid. I think this one was solid as well. I think this one moved a bit, and there wasn't much movement on the gear selector lever down here, which all moves lovely now. So with the aid of a diagram printed out of the manual, I proceeded to clean out the rest of the gunge out of the gearbox, and then remove the gearbox onto the floor and start to disassemble it. Flushed it out with kerosene and scrubbing brushes just to get the worst of the muck out, and then remove the sliding selector forks from the front of the gearbox by undoing the 4 screws, and then gradually withdrawing each set of shafts and gears, starting from the bottom gear train and then gradually working my way up to the top. And it was a case of cleaning all the gears with a wire wheel on an angle grinder. Unfortunately, the first day I was stripping this down, we had a power cut all day, so I was trying to do it just with a manual wire brush, and it was hopeless. Took all day, and they cleaned up okay, but they weren't brilliant. But the next day we had power on, so I went through all the gears again and the shaft and everything with the wire brush, and they cleaned up really well. Then I cleaned all the cases out with kerosene, and then wiped them all out so they were clean and ready to go. Cleaned all the bearing surfaces. So I had a full set of bearings. They were easy enough to order. I had the manual, and not only did it have the Colchester part numbers next to the bearings, it had also the bearing manufacturer name plus the bearing manufacturer number, and they're fairly international. So from a local bearing supply, I managed to get all the bearings for it, and then all the ball bearings and the springs for the indexing as well. It had what size ball bearings they were easy enough to order. And then the springs, again, it had a manufacturer's name and a number. And then a local online spring suppliers, I punched the number into their search engine, and it come up with the length, the width, and the thickness of the spring, and they were all bang on. So yeah, that worked really well. So I gently heated the cases around the bearing mounting areas, and then proceeded to place each bearing in place and drift them in with a suitably sized socket on an extension bar, just so I could tap it from the top of the case and get them into position. Then with the bearings in position, it was a case of reassembling the gearbox, like the Haynes manual says, in the reverse order you took it apart. I used the printout from the manual to help me with this, so that I got all the gears and spacers in their correct order as you were assembling the gear cluster. The other thing you had to remember was to sort of slide on the circlips where they needed to go on the shaft before pushing it through to the next chamber. So it all went okay. First gear cluster went in okay. I think it was a bit of a fiddle, but managed to get it on, making sure to get the last set of bearings on before inserting it into the very end bearing on the bottom set of gears, and then gently driving it home with a copper mallet, and it all went home quite snugly, and secure it down, put the circlips in their correct positions, and then once that's done, it's a case of moving on to the next shaft. So with the first gear cluster in it, it's moving on to the second gear cluster. Then it gets a bit more fiddly because you've got to get all the gears in position. There's more gears, there's more circlips and spacers, and then not only that, when the gears start meshing with the gears on the first shaft, they lock up sometimes, so you have to wiggle them around, move them backwards and forwards, and so you can get the shaft through. And it did take me about, well, yeah, if I'm honest, it took me 4 attempts, and by the third attempt I thought I'd sussed it. I got all the circlips in the correct position and the spacers, and it was all going in really nice, and it was sitting there, and I went and pushed the end bearing in through the outside of the case, and couldn't understand why it was going further in than it did when I took it out, because when I disassembled the gearbox, all the outer bearings were flush with the case. The face of the bearing was flush with the face of the case, but this was going beyond that. And then it was only when I sort of stood back and had a little look, suddenly noticed this spacer that I couldn't work out where it went. And yeah, you guessed it, it sort of went on the first cluster and it stopped the bearing going all the way into the case. So yeah, I had to take all the circlips off, take it back out, and then reassemble it. So with that done, it was moving on to the third gear cluster. It's a little bit easier because it's a 2-part gear shaft, so one gear cluster goes through the 2 inner chambers, and then the final part of the gear cluster feeds in from outside of the gearbox in, and that's your output or your power input shaft from the lathe. So the gear selectors assemblies were stripped down and derusted, and then new springs and ball bearings were installed on all the index points, and then reassembled the gear selector fingers on the front of the gearbox, and greased them all up first just to make sure they all moved nicely initially before the oil got around the gearbox, and finally then put the top selector forks on after cleaning all the shafts, putting new circlips on and new index ball bearings again. And then it was a case of putting the case back on. So then I needed to make a gasket for the case, which was easily done with a thick piece of artist card in a similar thickness to the gasket I took off. Rest the cover on the paper, draw a line round it to get the outline for your gasket, cut your gasket out, and then using a pencil scrape it around all the holes and all the inner edge of the casting, and then you rub your finger around the gasket paper, just feeling the inner edge and where the holes are, and sort of press quite hard against it with your finger, a bit like brass rubbing. And then you get an image of the inner casting and the holes on your paper, so you can take it off, carefully cut the gasket out, and then I use one of those cheap hole punch sets that you get from the auto jumbles. Just rest the paper against a piece of hardwood and then punch out the holes with the punches, and it makes a nice clean hole and a professional looking gasket. So with the gasket made, I then proceeded to paint on a light film of gasket compound around both machined surfaces of the gearbox cases. I then pre-filled the gearbox with oil, just enough so I could get oil into all the new bearings before putting the top cover on. With a gentle wiggle and a bit of persuasion, the case drops in quite nicely, just making sure that the gear selector drops into its corresponding slot, and all the gears operate okay before putting in the bolts and tightening the gearbox back up. So there it is, all ready to go back on. It was a bit of a struggle getting it back on on your own, because it's not the lightest thing in the world, and then you had to align the 3 shafts as well with the end of the gearbox, and it did take a bit of swearing, a little bit of jiggling, but eventually it dropped back in okay. Then tapped it home on its 2 index pins at the top, and then inserted its securing bolts to bolt it back to the lathe. With the gearbox secure, it was just a case of sliding the switch plate back on over the stop switch, installing the light cover and the little screw covers, and reinstall the end plate. Then finished it off by topping it up with oil up to the correct level on the sight glass. With that done, I installed a new shear pin on the lead screw side of the lathe, and a new shear pin on the input side. Then I moved on to the headstock. So removed the top cover to see what sort of a state it was inside. The oil was okay, but it was a bit gungy in there, so drained off the oil. So with the oil drained, there was little pockets of oil and sort of dirt down in the bottom, so I used what they call pig mat, this oil absorbent matting. It just sort of tore it up into little pieces, and I dropped it down there, and as you can see I had to sort of move it around with a little steel rod, because access was sort of impossible with your fingers. And then with that looking a lot cleaner, it was a time to top it back up with oil, making sure that I sort of covered everything with oil from the top. It's a lot easier filling it up from the top than it is from the little filler at the side. I cleaned up the catch plate at the top of the headstock, along with the 2 oil pipes that feed the headstock bearings. So the next job was to drop the oil on the saddle, remove the base plate, and clean out all the gunge. And I think we called it just in time, because the acids, as you can see, were starting to eat away at the bottom of the plate. So then again, it was a case of making a gasket for it in the same way as before. Just draw around it, cut it out, and then as it's a flat plate, I just sort of allowed a certain amount around the edge and then cut the middle of it out and punch the holes for the screws, and then reinstalled.
We would love to hear from you and just any teachers that spring to mind. Simon at greatesthitsradio.co.uk, that's the deal. Says 4:31, updated next year. The organisers of the golf majors and
So then I moved on to the handwheel assemblies on the cross slide, carefully disassembling them, making sure I didn't lose any parts, taking them all off and then putting them in a bath of kerosene and cleaning out all the years of swarf and cutting fluid that had built up into them, and then reassembled them with fresh grease or oil when needed. So the final job to get it up and running was replace the cam locks on the spindle. These hold the chuck in place, and they just served their time, and they were starting to crack and they're badly worn. So even with a new key, they were sort of hard to tighten up. They're sort of located in place with a little sprung-loaded pin that goes into the groove there to stop them coming out. I managed to get the Allen bolts undone, and then there's a spring. The spring came out easy enough, but these hardened pins, I just couldn't get them out because there's nothing to fix on the back of them. You know, you can't get anything in. I tried putting a drill in the same size, just seeing if I could sort of eke it out that way, but they were stuck solid, so I didn't know how to get them out because they were hardened. And then I remembered an old engineering friend of mine said the way to do it, if you've got hardened steel, the way to get it out is a masonry drill of all things. And this is where the diamond lap came in handy, because it's a tungsten, they've got a tungsten carbide end to them. So I just put it on the diamond lap and made sure, if you ever seen a masonry drill, the tungsten carbide end is wider than the drill that it's on. So I ground it down each side so that it was the same size as the drill, and then that fitted down the hole of the pin where the spring went. And then the other thing is to put a nice sharp cutting edge on the top of it, because if you know masonry drills, they're fairly blunt at the end because they're only going through brick and concrete. And that does the job. You sort of just lean on that a little bit and they just bite and cut through the hardened steel, and they literally drilled straight through the pin, and they were still being a bit of a problem. So I just let the drill go through till it went into the locks, and and then the pins come out, and then these came out. So happy days. So it's just a case of cleaning out the holes, putting in the new cam locks, and then holding them in place, dropping in the index pin and making sure that it's, because it's sort of rectangular at the end, making sure it drops into the slot correctly. then follow it up with a spring, then tighten the cap head bolts. I made sure the nose taper was clean and the mating faces, and bolted the chuck back on, and then the beast was back in action. So there we go, that's how you overhaul a Colchester Student 1800, and now she's ready for another 30 years hard work. So if you've got one of these or something similar, and the sight glass is a bit milky and you can't see in it, maybe drain the oil off, see what colour it is. If it's oil coloured, it's probably all right, just sort of top it back up again. If it comes out like mayonnaise, then I would sort of probably recommend at least taking the front cover of the gearbox off in situ and seeing what it's like inside. This one was too far gone, it needed overhauling, so yeah, I took the whole thing off. If you can get hold of a parts catalogue for it, that'll make your life easier, but just be systematic when you take it apart, lay everything out as it comes off, and then when you clean it and then put it all back together, keep it all together. Take lots of photos or videos if you haven't got a parts catalogue. Shout out to the parts lady at Colchester Spares. She emailed me out the parts catalogue because there's a few parts that I needed, but it has all the bearing manufacturer names and numbers, and the same with the springs and the sizes of the ball bearings, so you can order all them from bearing suppliers and spring suppliers. The belts they didn't have in stock, so the lady told me the number of the belt, so I can order them from the same place I order my bearings actually. But I did get the cam locks, which are sort of, you know, harder things to get. And sort of price wise, well, they're quite complicated. Square hole at the end, you know, and they're sort of accurate for this machine as well, because it's a high speed machine. So they were about £30 each plus VAT, which I thought was, you know, reasonable to get it up and running again. The pins, the hardened pins, they're about £22 each. So yeah, I don't know. Anyway, it needed them and it's all done. So there you go. Hopefully we'll get on to working on the Riley. Now I haven't got any distractions here. I've got both the machines up. Tidied the workshop up. You can't see it, but it is actually tidy. I'm not tripping over everything. So yeah, I'll see you again soon. If you like the video, give us a little like, just so I know that you know you're enjoying the content. Okay, so I'll see you again soon. And the final job was to replace the cam locks for the dig kit. So they get putting in the new, why do I keep forgetting what they're called?